Why is it that so many people reach midlife, or even much earlier, with a strange, quiet suspicion that they've been living someone else's life the whole time? They've followed the plan. Good grades, stable job, acceptable relationships, the right milestones hit at roughly the right ages. And yet somewhere underneath the achievements, there's this persistent, uncomfortable question they rarely say out loud. Is any of this actually me, or is this just what I was supposed to become? And it turns out there's a reason for that discomfort, and it's not a personal failure. Most people spend their entire lives becoming who they were expected to be, and mistake that finished performance for their actual identity. Carl Jung believed this happens to almost everyone, and that meeting your real self isn't something that happens automatically just because you get older. It's a deliberate, often uncomfortable process he called individuation, and most people never actually begin it. So let's talk about why that is, and more importantly, how to start. Because none of this is about failure. It's about a case of mistaken identity most people never get corrected, and if you understand how it happened, you can start finding your way back. When we're young, before we have any real say in the matter, we're handed an enormous amount of material to build ourselves out of. Family expectations, cultural scripts, gender roles, the unspoken hopes of our parents, the reactions of our teachers and peers. Jung believed that one of the heaviest burdens a child carries is what he called the unlived life of the parents. The ambitions they abandoned, the emotions they suppressed, the versions of themselves they never got to become. All of it quietly passed down and absorbed as instruction. You don't just inherit encouragement. You inherit unfinished business. And on top of that, you're handed a second set of instructions from the wider world. Be agreeable. Be impressive. Be useful. Be whatever earns safety and approval fastest. And so, piece by piece, you assemble a self out of other people's needs and expectations. And for a while, this works. It gets you through childhood. It earns you love, or something close enough to it. It gives you a stable role to perform, and performing that role well feels, for a long time, indistinguishable from actually being someone. But here's the hidden cost. The self you build this way isn't fake exactly, but it's incomplete, because it was constructed to be accepted, not to be true. Jung called this constructed self the persona, the mask assembled to meet the outside world, and he was clear that everyone needs one to function in society. The danger isn't wearing it. The danger is forgetting that it's a mask at all, mistaking the whole performance for the whole person. And over time, you internalize a very dangerous idea. This is just who I am. Not, this is who I learned to become in order to survive my particular circumstances, but simply, permanently, this is me. And that belief will quietly keep you from ever meeting anything beneath it, because the moment something inside you doesn't match the performance, a flash of anger that doesn't fit the agreeable role, a desire that doesn't fit the responsible one, a grief that doesn't fit the strong one, it doesn't register as new information about yourself. It registers as a malfunction to be suppressed. So instead of getting curious about it, you push it back down. You keep the performance consistent. And slowly, the range of what you allow yourself to feel, want, or become starts to narrow. You only express what fits the character you've already built. You protect the finished story of who you are, instead of ever risking what might happen if you let it stay unfinished. And that's the trap, because while the persona keeps you socially functional, it was never designed to contain the whole of you. And the longer you live entirely inside it, the harder it becomes to sense the difference between what you actually want and what you've simply gotten very good at performing. At some point, if you're honest, you notice a strange flatness underneath even your successes, a sense that you're fluent in being seen, but somehow absent from your own life. You can't afford to stop performing the role, because you're genuinely unsure what happens to your sense of self once the performance ends. So you keep going. And that's when the quiet, persistent loneliness sets in. The specific kind that has nothing to do with being alone and everything to do with never having been fully met, including by yourself. Jung believed that everything excluded from the persona doesn't simply vanish. It goes somewhere. It becomes what he called the shadow, all the disowned material, the anger, the ambition, the desires, the contradictions that didn't fit the accepted version of you. And the more polished and consistent your outward performance becomes, the more unfamiliar and unexamined that hidden material grows, until it starts leaking out in ways you don't recognize as belonging to you at all. Sudden irritability, unexplainable envy, a heaviness that shows up for no obvious reason. Jung's entire life's work pointed toward one central idea. You cannot meet your real self by refining the persona further. You meet it by turning toward the shadow, the unconscious, the parts of you that never got permission to exist, and slowly, deliberately, integrating them, not eliminating them, integrating them, so that the self you present to the world and the self you actually are start to become the same person again. Because real self-discovery requires actually going toward what you've excluded, not managing it more efficiently. Think about it. You don't meet yourself by getting better at the role you already play. You meet yourself in the moments the role doesn't quite cover, the unexpected tears, the sudden desire to quit something everyone expects you to want, the pull towards something that doesn't fit your resume of a personality. And if you keep interpreting those moments as inconvenient malfunctions instead of information, you miss the exact material that individuation is made of. You dismiss the dream that unsettled you. You explain away the attraction to a life that doesn't match your plan. You silence the impulse that doesn't fit who you've decided you are. And without realizing it, you keep sealing yourself further inside a character instead of ever stepping outside it to look. But you still sense something's missing, right? So what do? You lean on what you know, refinement. You try to become a better, more polished version of the role, instead of questioning whether the role was ever the whole truth to begin with. And this leads to something we could call performance escalation, where instead of meeting yourself, you simply get more convincing at being the character. It works, up to a point. You can become genuinely impressive at being who you've decided to be. But underneath, the original question never actually gets answered. It just gets buried under more achievement. So now even growth starts to feel hollow, like polishing a mask instead of removing one. This is where the disconnection deepens. But you're thoughtful, right? You should be able to figure this out. So you try to think your way into self-knowledge. You read about personality frameworks. You journal about your values. You collect insight after insight, hoping enough of it stacked together will finally add up to a self. None of it fully works, because Jung was clear that individuation isn't primarily an intellectual project. It's an encounter, something closer to relationship than analysis. And no amount of thinking about yourself substitutes for actually meeting the unfamiliar parts of yourself directly. There's no framework clever enough to answer the real question underneath it all. Who is here when I stop performing the story I've told about myself? That question can only be approached by actually sitting with the parts of yourself you've spent your whole life managing, not by describing yourself from a safe analytical distance. And when that disconnection becomes too uncomfortable to ignore, when the sense that something essential is missing gets too loud, that's when a final defense kicks in. You tell yourself, this is just who I am. I've always been like this. People don't really change. And now, instead of admitting you've never actually tested that story, you convince yourself that your current self is simply fixed and final. Not because you've genuinely explored the alternative, but because it hurts less than admitting you might have spent decades performing a role you never consciously chose. So how do we fix this? The first step, and this is non-negotiable, is that you have to stop treating your current identity as a finished fact instead of an ongoing process. Not because who you are right now is fake, but because mistaking the performance for the whole picture is exactly what keeps you from ever going further. When your sense of self depends on staying consistent with the character you built early on, you will do everything in your power to avoid the discomfort, contradiction, and uncertainty that real self-discovery actually requires. So the fix is to start treating the uncomfortable, inconvenient parts of yourself as information instead of malfunctions. You stop asking, does this fit who I've decided I am? And you start asking, what is this actually telling me about what I've been excluding? You stop immediately explaining away the desires, moods, and impulses that don't match your usual role, and start getting curious about them instead. You let yourself sit with the unfamiliar feeling of not fully knowing who you are, instead of rushing to resolve it with an old, comfortable answer. And yes, it's uncomfortable. It can feel disorienting, even a little frightening. like the ground underneath your identity is shifting. But it's not a step backward, because it's the actual beginning of the process Jung spent his life describing. The old identity told you that you were simply, finally, who you'd already become. The new one reminds you that you were always more than the character, you just hadn't gone looking for the rest yet. Being human means the process of meeting yourself never fully finishes, and that's not a failure, it's the design. You're allowed to discover something new about yourself at 40, at 60, at any point you finally stop to look. You're allowed to feel like a stranger to your own life for a while, as you sort out which parts were actually you, and which parts were simply expected of you. But the only way forward is to keep turning toward the uncomfortable, unfamiliar material in small, honest moments, not in one dramatic transformation, not a finished answer, not a tidy new identity to replace the old one, just repeated, quiet willingness to meet what you've been avoiding, until the mask and the person underneath it finally start to resemble each other. So if you're someone who has achieved everything you were supposed to and still feels strangely unmet, who suspects there's a version of yourself you've never actually encountered, if you've spent your whole life performing a role so well that you forgot to check whether it was ever really you, this is where you begin. You let go of the finished story. You stop defending the character. You start actually looking. Because you don't need a completed identity to start this process. You just need to be someone who's willing to meet the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime managing, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it complicates everything you thought you knew about yourself. And if you can do that, if you can stop performing long enough to actually look, you'll start to feel something you haven't felt in a long time. Recognition. Not because you finally became someone new, but because you finally met who was underneath the mask all along. If any part of this resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in these patterns, leave a comment and let me know what stood out. Chances are you're not the only one who feels this way, and sometimes naming the pattern is the first real step to breaking it. Thanks for listening to episodes of Kynn. Take care of your mind, and I'll see you in the next episode.